Welcome everyone. My name is Anne Hardy. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Join Digital. If you haven't visited us, in a few words, we do network and data services for smart everything buildings that those guys are building. And so I'm here to talk about security. And who thinks here that security matters? Can you raise your hand if you think? Okay, so good. So we're going to talk about that. So here with me, Robert Anton is CIO of Vornado, and Jay Mullen is CIO of Boston Properties. I'm going to let them introduce themselves very briefly, and then we're going to go over questions. Thanks.
Can you hear me? You can hear me. My name is Robert Anton. Good afternoon. I'm the EVP and CIO of Vornado Realty Trust. I oversee most of the company's technology initiatives, which would include all of the software that runs the enterprise, as well as technology in the buildings. And more, as we're going to talk about here, our jobs are expanding more inside the buildings than they are inside the corporate network.
So, I'm Jim Whalen, same role as Robert. I'll just maybe start just by putting some context to how we think about it, because I think Robert and I are very similar in our thoughts. And, when I look at the services we deliver, it's really in three distinctive buckets. So, we run the company, we run the enterprise, and the stack of applications and connectivity that everything from phones to desktops and how you run in our case, our enterprise. The second bucket is really around amenities, occupant experience, all the services that we do in our buildings has just become more of a part of our portfolio of work. And the third, I always say, is just the IoT of CRE, just the sheer growth in endpoints that we have to support. And you think about the dynamic of, we're going to talk about security. I mean, we try to frame it that, I can't have the crown jewels compromised in the first bucket. The second bucket, we're doing all this integration and demand, and we'll talk about tenants, like how we interact with our tenants and the use cases they're pushing us through. How do you secure that? And lastly, is just the sheer number of endpoints that is actually we're looking, that they're appearing and how we don't have that as an access point that affects the occupancy of an asset that has thousands of people in it on a daily basis. So I know we're going to talk about it, but just kind of framing it. That's our world and how I think both of us think about it. So,
thank you. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that, cybersecurity has become like not just a buzzword, but a scare for a lot of people. So, and how about you? How has cybersecurity changed the way you manage your buildings and your properties?
Well, so I would say you got to go back 10 years. 10 years ago, buildings stood by themselves, and a campus-wide or a portfolio-wide network wasn't necessary and oftentimes wasn't there. Today, it's pretty much a requirement. Our campus-wide, wide area network that connects our buildings is essential for the operation of the building. So it's been the explosion of the IoT devices about both amenities and the way buildings are controlled that changed the entire landscape of what we deal with. And so from a cybersecurity point of view, now that everything is on one network, you don't want your elevators being compromised. You don't want digital signage being taken over. Your turnstiles have to operate, and on and on and on. I mean, that's to me what's changed our dynamic in the buildings, is now the building network is as big and as important as the corporate network.
And to add some additional perspective, what we're seeing, we're in a very active development cycle right now with construction of new buildings around the country. And what we're finding is, the layering of technologies that are going into these new buildings, as well as the digitization, I will use that roughly, of these systems to push IP further and further into the controllers, into other points in the building. So Salesforce Tower, which we opened just over a year ago, compared to the same 1.5 million square foot asset that's a legacy asset, has a 1x to 2x factor in the sheer number of IP endpoints that are on that building. So again, you think about the occupancy of these assets in the thousands, and how you then have to protect the layers of technology, the digitization of these systems to really protect, again, the integrity of the building for your tenants. So,
because what inning are we in with respect to this? The answer is we're still in the early innings. We're seeing this big 2 and 3 and 4x growth of IP addresses inside of a buildings, and we're still at the very beginning of the buildings really being fully controlled by digital software and platforms. We're doing so with Salesforce, which was a great development. We're doing Farley Station a few blocks that way. And Farley is a really interesting one because it's 1 million square foot of rentable space. It's a 4 million square foot building. And we have stakeholders. We have Amtrak, the post office, LIRR, Vornado, and all four have to cohabitate in a single structure with a series of networks that somehow run the building and keep us private. Challenges are very different than they used to be.
Yeah. So I want to talk about tenants. I mean, you talked a little bit about tenants, and you yourself as tenant as well sometimes. But before I go there, I want you to also to understand how. So CIOs traditionally it's IT. But there is facilities, there is operations, right? I mean, how do you interact within your own companies with those functions, right? I mean, the CIO seems to be everything now, right? But at the same time, operations, they might think the same, right? So who owns what?
So for us, we've been on a partnership. It's really about partnership with our operating units. And for Boston Properties, we've had this probably 15-year cycle of really the network becoming more of a prominent role in how we support our OT assets, our operating assets. And it's been a journey. It's a journey. And I think a lot of companies struggle because, your engineering or your property management traditionally is talked analog. That's the language they talk, and now it's really in an IT, and how do you drive and bridge IT disciplines and practices into what traditionally hasn't cared about practices and controls and basic things of how you run an enterprise. So bridging that has actually been it's a challenge, but an opportunity that we've done it through partnership mostly, and so.
I think very similarly for us, we've been managing the networks in the buildings now for probably 10 years, but the operations people still go out and seek out and buy what they need to buy. And the question is, when are you brought into the process to examine and make sure it integrates with the network well? I think for us, and partly we're very different in the fact that our whole portfolio is essentially here, and you support something all over the country. I think for us, since our wide area network campus now is fully developed, we have a nice compromise where we're the plumbers who provide the plumbing, the pipes, and the security, and our operations people are the ones seeking out the new platforms and devices to run the buildings. And as long as we coordinate securing and examining, it works well.
And for us, we've had mentioning that active development cycle, it also involves construction development. So really that we broke those barriers. It takes time, to actually do what we typically do as a converged network. There's a building up. We have a building up here that we built that has, again, all the systems lay on that, and then cyber's embedded into the design of the network for the building systems that are in the asset, and then our ability to control it and monitor it and all the above, right? So.
Okay. So now about tenants, how do you interact with your tenants about cybersecurity? What do they expect from you?
Well, so we get, from a cyber perspective, as opposed to other, we're both challenged now with more tenant demands to connect to our systems and have collaboration. But from strictly cyber, for us, we're not seeing a ton, but we're seeing more and more tenants want to do a cyber evaluation of Vornado before they sign, right? And so, again, we're not getting a ton of that, but, and partly what we say to them is, we're not exactly sure how it relates to you, because other than perhaps personal identities in badging and security systems, right, is the biggest one. Otherwise, their networks are separate from ours anyway. Once they put their key in their door, they're on their own network. But we're getting more of that from tenants asking about our cyber profile.
Also, and like one of the dynamics, like both Robert and I we're multi-tenanted office providers, right? Multi-buildings. We don't control a corporate campus where you control everything, right? A lot of our services end at the door. We don't define lighting systems that our tenants put in. We don't define sensors they put. This whole thing about sensors, our tenants are not necessarily going to give that sensor data. So it's really about the common area services, whether it be BMS, HVAC, access control, common areas and collaborative areas that are built into the space that we have control over. I do think that those boundaries are going to break down, and you're going to see more potentially information flow as you try to achieve a smart building, which requires access to those data points in your tenant space. So it's a very interesting dynamic, I mean, in my view, both from an operating perspective and a security perspective.
Yeah, I'd say what inning are we in? I still think we're in the early innings. When I agree wholeheartedly, when you have a building and the requirement for the building is that there are sensors everywhere, even in tenant spaces, and the data has to be shared from the landlord's perspective, that breaks the paradigm that our relationship ends at the door, which is a major change.
Good. Okay, so you touched a little bit about information flow. I had one question that was not in my list, and sorry about that, but it made me think about, how about data? So you have equipment or sensors in the common area of the building. Do you see tenants sometimes concerned about, this is my data, and what do you do with it, right? Let's say you have cameras, and do you have...
Well, we have many, very highly sensitive facilities in our portfolio, and so you go from camera data to name PII information that you're collecting, both from an occupant and a visitor perspective, guest perspective, and people care about that information, right? So if you're managing that, the controls over that data, the practices, again, traditionally property operations, that's not their concern, and we've had to elevate our game and the controls in certain locations because of the tenant concern about that, right? So
we're not seeing a lot of that at this point in terms of sensor data. The only area that we've seen that I think we probably both share that, so the badging systems that get you into the building do have the RFID codes that oftentimes they want to share with us. What we're getting a lot now is the tenant saying, I've got my own badging system, and I want your turnstiles to open up our badging systems. So both of us have ended up with tenants where we have had to interface their access management systems with ours, meaning that we have their RFID codes that get them into their doors inside of our systems. That's been one area where they're, of course, very concerned. And then for me, the other one is we have facial recognition at about 4 buildings now. And so that's the first time we're getting people saying, wait a minute, you've scanned my face, you recognize my face every time I walk through the turnstile, and we're getting a little of that.
So I'm just laughing because Robert and I have become, I think, access control specialists. And again, that talks about the change in the nature of our work. We're both, in the last 3 years, I've just become an access control geek in a little bit, and it's because we've had to, right?
Yeah.
By the way, it's a little surprising to me because while the tenant's motive is that I don't want to have to carry 5 cards, and if I have a tenant in a bunch of your buildings, but the reality is it's a pretty...
I want to use this.
That would be better because at least you could segregate your identity. But when it's a card and I have to read your card, I basically could get into any of your buildings.
Yeah. So security breaches, I hope you never had any, but I guess we've heard the news that there are some. So how do you deal with that? Cybersecurity transcends everything, right? So it goes, I mean, between you and the tenants and more intra-tenants, how do you deal with that? I mean, how you...
So luckily, you know, both of us have had cybersecurity incidents, and you know, I think again, looking at how we think about it, you know, there's a framework. It was called NIST, you know, and it's like protect, detect, respond, right? So there's a framework for how you think about security. If you went back 10 years ago, all our eggs were in the protect basket, right? We had no ability to kind of listen and understand, you know, things that are happening in our environment, in the detection, let alone respond. Like when there's an incident, like how do you marshal your team, marshal outside resources, forensics to actually tackle a problem, right? So that's been a maturation in the industry, and especially in our platforms for how, and I know Robert and both of us have kind of built. I mean, I'll tell a quick story. We had a real estate company that actually got a hard ransomware hit. You know, had none of this capability, and their first call was to call us and help them find resources to do the incident response, right? So we've had, so going back to your question, we do have incidents. Luckily, very few are what I would call intrusive, requiring, you know, a level of actually employing forensics and going through the full exercise. But, you know, we had an incident last January, where, you know, an outside contractor comes in with a memory stick. They needed that memory stick to service equipment. You know, that's affected a downloaded payload, right? 3 days later, it wakes up, it starts to communicate with a known ransomware node. You know, our monitoring system, our detection systems caught that, but then we declared it an incident, and we had to take the machine offline, had to rebuild it, had to actually spend money. You know, so again, these capabilities has been a maturation over the last couple of years in how we've been able to respond.
The foundation of which is the incident response plan. So that framework and that maturation starts with a very stable and well-defined incident response plan. When the incident occurs, you have to have a playbook you go into where you classify the incident with urgency and severity, and based on where it falls, you have a guide for what you're supposed to do. And I think once the organization develops the incident, so we spent probably 6 to 8 months developing a fairly comprehensive incident response plan. You got to practice it, and people have to be prepared. But once they are, it's like any other fire drill. You know, you respond.
We've actually started, we just started running our first cyber tabletop exercise at our properties, our large properties. We did one in Boston, we did one in San Francisco, we'll do one in New York this summer, and it's just been great having all the disciplines in the room and running through a cyber. I mean, the property operations, all right, I got a water leak, I got a you know, a physical impact on the property. Well, let's change that and talk about a cyber focused compromise of an asset. So that's been a very informative process. And again, just a useful kind of tool as we've taken those learnings and then applying it across our program.
Okay. So what are the biggest cyber threats your biggest cyber threats?
Well,
right.
I think it's, again, on the building side, it's that you have all of these systems, elevator systems, badging systems, camera systems, digital signage. Digital signage is massive. All of these systems, a breach to any one of them could be, I don't want to say disastrous. A digital signage breach would be disastrous if the content that was put on that digital sign was offensive, right? An elevator breach is inconvenient, but you can take the elevators offline and run them manually, right? So I think when you segment your network into the various systems and you identify which systems are more critical than others, you know, that's the way we look at what we're protecting and where our risk lies.
And if you look at the outside landscape, who's trying to get in, it is right now all about criminal for financial gain. Criminal networks trying to get financial gain. So they're just trying to find, we're just another set of assets, just like any other that's trying to be exploited and compromised. You know, I don't think we've had like a targeted, we're going to go after real estate and we're going to target real estate necessarily, but it's really just like any other company in industry that is just looking for exposure points, trying to get that employee to click on that email, download payload, and then obviously exploit that for financial gain. And that's been predominantly what's going on in the environment right now for billions of dollars.
Frankly, we're very happy that we're not in the financial services business specifically, and we're not a bank. The banks give us our best protection because they're the #1 target.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah. So we've all heard that sensors and smart devices are just exploding in buildings. I mean, you have probably tons of devices coming up in your building. So what strategies have you adopted as building owners to manage the scale and complexity of Internet of Things, or now people call it Internet of Everything?
It's hard. It's a hard one because we don't know what's in front of us, and we're really still in an embryonic phase of development as it relates to sensors and how buildings are going to run. So for us, it's just making sure that the network, our wide area network that supports our buildings is, I hate to say it, but it's faster than our corporate network today. And soon it will be as robust or more robust. So for us, it's make sure that the plumbing that we're establishing through which all of the data will flow is very, very fast and very strong. And then be ready to deal with what comes at you.
Yeah, for us, we completely started a journey 5 years ago and have literally ripped apart every building, segmented everything, hundreds of segmentation projects, layered services, layered monitoring. Again, pretty aggressive and big investment by the company. But just given the nature of our assets and what is in our portfolio and the demographics, it's been, and that's allowed us to scale. You know, a capital project comes along, needs to redo the cameras to analog to digital or IP. You know, all those just get absorbed from a scaling of how the framework has actually been installed and working. So,
by the way, kind of the ABCs of, you know, people say, well, is this a Herculean task? The answer is, it's like anything else. It's a lot of building blocks. It's actually not that complicated. Segmenting the networks very, very carefully, making sure that no two vendors can see each other, and doing the basics, multi-factor authentication, no outside, no egress, ingress points that are not protected. So the same fundamentals that you use to protect the corporate network, if you apply them over time on the building network, the answer is you end up in pretty good shape.
How do you know which devices are connected to the network? I mean, do you want to know? And do you need to know?
Yeah, there's discovery tools that will go all the way down to every point, and there's a whole set of new solutions that are coming on the market in the last 6 to 12 months that are focused on IoT specifically, right? They're coming out of industrial and coming SCADA and coming into our real estate market and vertical. Some very interesting offerings that we're looking, and we're going to be doing some POCs around. But in the meantime, we've got other discovery tools and finding out what's on the network, right?
It is important. I mean, you're managing all the VLANs. So if you're managing all the VLANs, you have to know who's in it, and you have to know how many devices are in it. But to your point, one of the things on a corporate network, discovery software was very mature, and so it was very easy on the corporate network to find nodes. On the IoT network, many of these devices were never really built to be scanned, and they're hard to detect. So you do have a.
And you're going to be, and just the other challenge in real estate is that a lot of these systems are put in and they have a 10, 15-year life, and you have to wait for the useful life of that system to come. And we still have a lot of analog cameras, but they'll all be IP at some point. So it's really like you're dealing with this kind of challenge of some very old systems, never architected, and embedded with security, that we're going to be living with and having to navigate and isolate so it doesn't cause a problem, right?
So to the crowd here, I mean, what is the one advice you want to give to building owners like you about securing their building? I mean, if there was one thing that you feel like everyone has to do, I mean, what is this one thing?
Well, one, don't be overwhelmed by the problem. Take it one step at a time. It is an important area to focus on, and stick to the fundamentals. A lot of times somebody looks at this and they say it's just so overwhelming and complicated. Stick to the fundamentals. It's very, very important to do. Take it one step at a time, and I think it gets much less scary.
I would agree. So nothing to add there. So.
How do you stay yourself on top of the threats, and how do you have a threat intelligence program, or can you elaborate a little bit?
I depend on him.
So a couple things. We're pretty well. Both Robert and I are plugged in. We actually were involved 2 years ago in the founding of a group called the Real Estate Cyber Consortium. Robert and I were just in Chicago, which is really about focused on best practices and elevating that availability in the industry, and then also influencing our providers, our integrators, our maintenance companies around a set of standards that the company really, the water has to elevate here and be elevated. So we've been very involved with a group, founding this group, and it's not just people in facilities as owners, there's banks and education institutions and others, even an oil and gas company that's in the mix there. But then separately, we pay for threat intelligence. We have feeds that come in to my security team, and we do monthly calls with some incident response specialists. So there's a cadence for how we kind of at least understand the landscape and the trends and what's going on.
But I do think there's a good RECC is the name of the organization, and we're 2 years in, as Jim said. I think we're just getting our sea legs now in terms of membership and objectives. I think we'll see more of it in Realcomm, where we're kind of a more formal rollout. But we're, and I don't want to say I wasn't as optimistic as you were at the beginning of it, but sometimes these organizations don't achieve the traction. But I think these efforts are going to be very good at creating a forum for within the building space, where we can really share both information and drive standards.
Totally focused on buildings, right? Buildings and facilities and the security around those assets. So.
Okay. So I think we're running out of time. Jim and Robert will be here, I think, a little longer, so you can, of course, talk to them. You're welcome to come to our booth as well if you want to talk more about security. But thank you, Jim and Robert. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.